Good morning and welcome to the first session on climate policy of the State of the Union Conference. We are going to talk about trade issues as they are emerging quite vividly as part of the European debate. The European leaders have decided on a new target for 2030, the at least 55% based on 1990 levels. And that has created an impact already on the carbon market. So the carbon market today is hovering around 50 euros per ton of CO2. And so the issue of competitiveness and possible carbon leakage is appearing. And so the carbon border adjustment mechanism is on the table. And, we will see what the European Commission is going to propose in a couple of weeks. But before going, and I have an excellent panel with me today, before going and presenting the panel, I would like to recall you that there is a poll question that has been announced through the web. And the poll question is about the Europeans' carbon border adjustment mechanism, whether that is going to be in place by 2023, as the European Council expressed it, or will it face a delay? Will it be 2028, but still be in place at some point in time before 2030? Or will it never be in place? And so that poll question is to you, and please take a moment to fill in the poll question. And in the meantime, I'm going to introduce the panel, and I'm very pleased to have an excellent panel here before us. They are connecting from all over the world. And so I'm full of appreciation for the tremendous flexibility that Vangelis Vitalis is showing from New Zealand, Pizer from the United States, because spanning the 24 hours is almost complete. So welcome to my panel. And the first panelist I would like to introduce is Susanne Droege. She is Senior Fellow in the Global Issues Division of the Institute of International and Security Affairs in Berlin. Susanne, thank you very much. You are a well-known expert on the issue of the carbon border adjustment mechanism and on trade issues as part of climate policy. So we are great to have you here. My second panelist is Billy Pizer. Billy is professor at Duke University. He is fellow at the Resources for the Future and research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Billy has been very much involved in the, some 10 years ago, in the first Obama administration, if I may say it like that, in which Billy was very much involved also in issues related to what we are going to discuss today. So Billy, we appreciate it's very early morning for you, but really welcome into the panel. And the third panelist is Vangelis Vitalis. Vangelis is Deputy Secretary of the Trade and Economic Affairs Department in New Zealand. And Vangelis has been very active in the WTO. Apart from having lots of diplomatic missions, has always been very much involved in trade issues. So welcome as well, Vangelis. And we know it's late evening for you, so we appreciate you being on the call. So I wondered whether there are already the first elements of the poll coming in. And if not, I think that the voting is still going on. I propose we are simply starting our discussion. And after the first introductions, we come back to the poll. So, Susanne, I think the European debate has been very active and lots of hurdles are in front of us. What is your assessment of the situation? Can you sketch that out in a few minutes before passing to Billy and to Vangelis? Susanne.
Yes, thank you, Jos. Good morning, everyone. I think we have several dimensions, what I hear from the European debates, and I have probably three which I can highlight for a start. One is what is the proposal, the legislation that is coming going to look like? That especially is about the design of this instrument that is supposed to charge imports when they enter the EU and address carbon leakage. The second is what will be reactions of trade partners? Will there be protest or will there be cooperation? And the third one is legal hurdles and all the technicalities around the tool. I think that there's a lot of speculation around this tool, and this also is making it difficult to make a forecast. But what we know so far is that the plan includes to extend the European emissions trading scheme to imports. That means the hook of the whole system will be what we have installed in the EU already. Then, of course, the question will be, will it be applied to all sectors, only one sector? Will there be a test phase, which would be very, very good to have because nobody tested this kind of tool before? And what actually is going to happen around this tool? So there's a full load of proposals coming up in July, the Fit for 55 package. And of course, this is one tool in the toolbox to achieve the European climate targets that have been increased lately. So then industry is really, really paying a lot of attention because we know that legally we have already decided that the new free allocation that was tackling leakage so far is going to be phased out over time until 2030 probably. Will there be changes to this plan? And the discussion that are held often, also the decision made in the parliament is about whether or not to keep it, the free allocation, as part of the leakage, anti-leakage policy, because we also need to handle somehow export rebates or the problem of leakage that comes up in third markets. Well, and the reactions to this plan or to this overall setting are very mixed and then externally. And I think this is a political part much more than the internal debate. The internal debate is more technical, while the external debate is very, very political. Trade partners reacted so far with skepticism, with many questions. No surprise, because I said the design is unclear. Although the announcement is made that it will be designed compatible with WTO rules, there are questions about whether or not specific issues are being legal. One is the free allocation that could be kept up, or export rebates that are probably prohibited subsidies under WTO law. Then, of course, retaliation is a big issue. Some countries are just reacting that way. They say, no, sorry, this is not going to happen. We had this with the aviation ETS extension in 2012. We will react in the same way. That is, I don't want to name any countries here, but we can discuss later where the threat is from this kind of approach. Then some other reactions are rather friendly, because if only a few sectors could be covered, like cement or steel, some countries react like, well, our steel, our cement is pretty clean. We don't have to think about this because we will just show that we outperform EU producers, and then probably won't pay anything at the border. Or other reaction is, we have a CO2 price. How will you take care of our CO2 price? And the third reaction, that is because we will talk about the US as well, is, we probably won't come up with a CO2 price anytime soon. How can we cooperate nevertheless on this tool? Because we have strict regulation in place, probably an indirect kind of charging the CO2. So my last point is, where are the hurdles? I see technical hurdles abound. One is that if sticking to the EU ETS as a hook or a connection point, then under the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the legal way to do a adjustment at the border is to have an indirect tax in place, and the EU ETS is not per se an indirect tax, so you have to find legal explanations to claim that it is one. And of course, not to discriminate countries or products in the markets is a key feature that should show up, and I think there are ways to do it that way. And of course, another one is, which data do you use, apply, and make transparent? And I think this is an interesting feature, because it can't go without that. Showing that is working against leakage needs to be shown by showing that the data are going in that direction. But still, I think at the moment, internally, the EU is struggling with finding the right data to calculate that first CBAM. No matter which sector you talk about, there's a lot of knowledge that is not really visible or accessible at the moment out there. So I would stop here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Susanne. A whole list of things and uncertainties. You know, that's what you are outlining. And moving the microphone to Billy. You know, Billy, you were very much involved in the Waxman-Markey drafting of the bill some 10 years ago. You had, for sure, lots of internal discussions. When John Kerry came to Brussels, his first visit, we all hoped that he would at least diplomatically support the CBAM plans of the Europeans, and that was rather reserved. What is your reading of the situation, being present in the administration 10 years ago and now at the university observing, you know, the new policies of the administration? Billy, you have the floor.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the privilege of speaking with this group this morning. I should be clear, I don't have any, you know, inroads into the current administration. So I'm just kind of thinking about the discussions that, you know, we were having, you know, 10, 11, 12 years ago about this topic, which I would just emphasize was a really critical piece of the discussions as the legislation was being crafted. This was one of the things that really eventually got the votes that was necessary in the House of Representatives. I think you know, as we've discussed, or I guess we haven't discussed yet, you know, there are really two ways to deal with concerns about leakage and competitiveness. I always, you know, think about the fact that you kind of think about the price levels, you know, in the EU and out of the EU, and the domestic pricing policy is raising the prices in the EU. And so you have two things you can do at the border. You can try to depress the price effects on products at the border, or, you know, for the EU products, or you can try to raise the price of the imports coming in from the outside so that they're on a level playing field. And when we were having the discussions, you know, 10 years ago, I would say there was a fairly strong feeling within a lot of the economists, at least in the administration, that a mechanism to lower the prices domestically at the border was preferable to some sort of border measures. So the legislation that came out had a large element of output-based allocations associated with these energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. And that was the primary mechanism for dealing with leakage and competitiveness. And there was a big analysis that was done by an interagency task force showing that the output-based allocations largely addressed leakage and competitiveness concerns. And I would say that there were really two reasons that were behind that, you know, that line of thought. One was just practicalities, and Susanne kind of talked about a little bit of it. You know, it's to do the carbon border adjustment measures. You not only need to understand you not only need to understand the carbon content or greenhouse gas content of imports. You also need to understand the entire production chain. So it's not just the country from which the goods are being imported from and what their carbon policies are, it's the entire value chain of where the inputs were produced. And that just seemed like it was practically a lot harder than establishing what the carbon content was at the border, you know, which would be hard, but not as difficult as tracing the product. I think the second thing that was important in everybody's minds was the political issues. And there were two parts to this. One was the issue that Susanne raised, which was, you know, you're trying to engage other countries and get them to do more ambitious policies. Is it constructive to use border measures as a stick to try to push people into doing that? Or is it better to use other tools, recognizing that a lot of people are going to be on the receiving end of that stick? I think the second thing that a lot of some people were at least concerned about was the risk that this could spiral into more protectionism domestically, that it was a vehicle that people would use strategically in domestic debates. So for all of those reasons, there was an emphasis more on the output-based allocations. I guess I would just end by saying, I think the situation now is a bit different in a number of ways. One way is that I think the policies that are at least being articulated, and certainly the prices in the EU, are quite a bit higher than what we were contemplating a decade ago. And I think the analysis in terms of what the trade effects will be, I haven't seen, kind of a modern analysis of what that looks like and how effective output-based allocations or the carbon adjustment measures would be. I think the second thing that's important is that we're no longer just talking about carbon pricing as the main policy. I mean, in Europe, there's always been a discussion of these other policies. In the US 10 years ago, that was the main policy. And now in the US, there's carbon pricing is much lower on the scale of what's being discussed. And I guess, finally, I would just emerge that intellectually, there's been a lot of thought about these border measures over the past 10 years. And, recently there's been, some discussion that these are not just a tool to try to get people into some sort of club, so to speak, but these may need to be a permanent fixture of a global system when you have different countries looking at different levels of ambition. Thanks.
Thanks, Billy. Turning to Vangelis, you have been primarily active in the trade field, and you may be surprised by the urgency that the climate, diplomats are bringing on the table. It has to happen overnight. And second, the perspective that Billy has been creating, working more on the export side than on the import side, which is not particularly in line with what the WTO has been having as a tradition, I would assume. And your reaction to this, and also your initiative, perhaps, that you have been introducing, with a number of like-minded countries. You have the floor, Vangelis, and thank you for having you.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak. And maybe the first thing to say is I'm not surprised at the urgency. I think even on the trade side, we do understand the urgency, and I think the point that I want to leave you with is that trade needs to contribute here. Trade is not going to be the silver bullet that solves the climate crisis, but trade can certainly be an enabler. And I want to talk a little bit about an initiative that our Prime Minister launched together with 5 other countries, Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, Fiji, and Costa Rica, together with our Prime Minister, launched an initiative called the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. Let me step back one moment and sketch for you the context that we see here. And then I want to speak about the trade response. There are some classical responses that are very familiar to everybody. And then I want to talk about what I think is quite an innovative approach that we have taken, something we are calling concerted open plurilateralism, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. So let me begin with the contextual observation. First of all, there is a great deal of uncertainty driven by COVID, the health crisis, the economics. But there is no uncertainty on climate change. We know we have a serious crisis. We know we have a looming human catastrophe. And I live in a part of the world where many of our Pacific Island neighbors are genuinely threatened within a generation of literally disappearing. So this is not an academic thing, even for a trade guy. My second observation is that we have been galvanized, I think, over the last 2 or 3 weeks by President Biden's global summit. And I think that has brought very clear attention to the potential for US leadership here, and that together with the other major emitters, we might actually generate some momentum. My third contextual observation is this year sees the conjunction of several major gatherings of ministers and leaders, COP26 to state the obvious, but please don't forget the WTO ministerial at the end of the year. And indeed, New Zealand is hosting and chairing the APEC meeting. And of course, APEC with the 21 economies, including the United States, including China, they have their leaders meeting in November as well, exactly around COP26 and the WTO ministerial. And my final contextual observation is I think there is a growing understanding that trade needs to help contribute and enable a solution. So how does trade contribute? There are essentially, I think, 5 ways. First of all, unilaterally. each of us could be sensible and we could reform our own environmentally harmful subsidies, ranging from fossil fuel subsidies to the subsidies that many economies, whether they're in the EU, the United States, China, or India, provide to fertilizers, for overuse of water, etc., etc. The second area in a trade sense that we can deal with is, of course, regulation. Regulation that drives standards, that drives environmental performance and improvement. And of course, the third way is, of course, green procurement. That's the sort of the unilateral area. The second is, of course, multilateral. And that's, of course, the World Trade Organization. I think here we need to be very honest with each other that at the WTO, in the trade and environment space, we are not moving quickly. We are moving in a very slow manner. And it is all rather disappointing. The narrow agenda that we have there is not going to move the dial, as one would say, on climate change. The third area is, of course, bilateral trade agreements, where we could do green procurement initiatives, trade and environment. We could put the Paris Agreement in the trade agreement itself. We could also liberalize environmental goods, free up the trade, lower the price, and of course, for environmental services. The fourth area is the kind of work that the APEC and the OECD are doing, providing an ecosystem of support, generating research and analysis that can drive change. And the fifth area, is what we're calling plurilaterals. Environmental goods agreement, of course, which unfortunately failed, but of course that was very focused on environmental goods. But the one I really want to draw your attention to is, of course, the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. So my observation is, this agreement, as I said, Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, New Zealand, Costa Rica, and Fiji, launched by my Prime Minister, is in three parts. First of all, the classical trade response: eliminate tariffs on environmental goods, make commitments on environmental services. Second, some principles that would guide eco-labeling. But the third one, which I would argue is number one, the low-hanging fruit, but also would make a fundamental change in our climate change challenge. And that is using trade rules to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. So as we all know, G20 leaders, and indeed G7 leaders, and indeed APEC leaders, since 2009, have said they want to reform and indeed eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. The situation since 2009, I'm embarrassed to say, has actually got worse. We are subsidizing even more fossil fuel subsidies. The elimination of fossil fuel subsidies will be the equivalent of nearly just over 10% of the carbon mitigation that we would need. It's also the equivalent, by the way, of more than 120 countries stopping their emissions tomorrow. So this is actually big. Now, how do we do this? Well, what we thought was we should, in the way in which we dealt with agricultural subsidies, we should use trade rules to also deal with fossil fuel subsidies. And the six of us have designed this, are in the process of concluding, well, we are hoping to conclude the negotiations this year in time for COP26 to demonstrate how you can use trade rules, enforceable provisions that would eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. And then what we intend to do is to go around to G20 and G7 economies and say, since 2009, you said you wanted to reform fossil fuel subsidies. You have not been able to do so. Here is a trade agreement that actually reforms and has enforceable measures that would actually drive reform. So look, let me just conclude there to say four things. One, trade should clearly contribute. But we need to be, my second point, we need to be imaginative. And the idea of this concerted, open, plurilateral, the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, is not because we six, Norway, Switzerland, New Zealand, Costa Rica, Fiji, and Iceland, think we're going to solve the problem by ourselves. What we want to do is be a pathfinder and for others to join us. And that's my third point. The opportunity is there for G7 and G20 economies to join us in time for COP26 to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. That's my closing comment, that is really my hope. And if I may say so, Executive Order 14008 of the Biden administration clearly states, and this is a game changer that I think we might have forgotten. It says that the US administration will present, that the White House will present a budget that eliminates fossil fuel subsidies, the US government subsidization of fossil fuel subsidies by 2022. That is a dramatic game changer. And we have hopes in APEC that we can agree at least a standstill on fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vangelis, for this promising perspective, and also you as a trade expert minister making the point that trade must contribute to the climate emergency that we are facing. I think that's a very encouraging point. In the meantime, the polls have come in, and the polls are saying that some 60% of the Europeans of the poll is indicating that the CBAM in Europe is coming. Some 28% is saying it may be coming only by 2028, and only 18% is saying it is never coming. So I think that the pollsters are indicating that there is a quite great expectation that the CBAM is going to kick in by 2023. Now, if we would for a moment take that element forward, 2023 is very soon. That means that the scope for cooperation is very limited. We will have a COP, you will have the APEC meeting. That's very encouraging to know. There is the WTO ministerial, but still the time slot is very limited. Now, what I would like to bring on the table is a variation on the plurilateral suggestion that Vangelis has been making. Is a so-called climate club possible, in particular between the EU, the US, and China? You know, if we take the APEC perspective, because that would cover more than half of the global emissions today. Would that be a perspective you think we may not reach overnight, but we may reach in a realistic time frame? If I turn to you first, Vangelis, you will be an important player in the WTO, in the APEC, and hopefully also in the COP26, and your government is very active. Would you see that short reply as a perspective we could work towards? The fossil fuels is, of course, squarely there for China. Vangelis?
So, I mean, maybe to make a couple of observations. First of all, I think that it is going to be really important that the major economies are able to work together and to collaborate on this. Unfortunately, I must say, I don't see many signs of that. And instead, I see a very serious risk here that actually the CBAM is then implemented and it is immediately challenged. And that challenge, most likely in the WTO, will put further pressure on a system that is already very fragile. And by that, I do mean the trade rules, system. And I do think that is a serious challenge. I also think there is a serious risk of retaliation, that various economies will look to retaliate. And that, again, puts further pressure on that trade system. And I really do think that is a very serious risk that needs to be factored in here as we think about this. I want to make another observation, if I may. And the first is, look, I'm an economist. I started my career at the OECD Secretariat, and I can see the appeal of a CBAM. It has a good economic logic to it, and we're always internalizing the externality, so I can see that. As a trade official, I must say the concern that I have is the perception that this risks becoming a very protectionist measure. And in that context, I think it's really important that there are sort of a set of principles that govern this. Now, in my mind, there are at least 10, which gives you a sense of the complexity, which both Susanne and Peter touched on, which is, this is a seriously challenging set of issues. The 10 are, first of all, WTO consistency. That I think is vital. The second is non-discrimination. The third is transparency. The fourth is robustness in a scientific sense. The fifth is demonstrating necessity. So there is something called the necessity test. Then there's proportionality. It should be the least trade restrictive measure. It should also be predictable and certain. And the revenue that is generated from this, there will be a temptation to use this for other reasons, but the revenue should be directed to to resolving environmental problems. And my final one, the 10th one, is consultation. And that is vital. Consultation with partners, not just New Zealand, but developing countries in particular, who will be deeply suspicious of this as as another way to restrict their own development. That, I believe, is a real challenge that threatens the initiative, which, as I said, as an economist, you can think of it as a very sensible approach, but as a trade policy person, I can see all sorts of challenges there. And I did want to raise the risk of the pressure this will put on a trading system that is already very fragile indeed. That really does trouble me.
Well, thank you, Vangelis. These arguments have been made all along, since the start of the ETS, so it's not the first time. But at the same time, we try in Europe to find replies to that. So if I turn to Susanne, who has been observing in the first row the European debate, what would be your reply to all these, 10 quite tough criteria that Vangelis just lined out? And then I would like to turn to Billy, where the United States would find itself, quite likely intellectually, we understand, Billy, you are no longer in the government, but still, there is an argument to be made, but how it is being made is going to be very important. So, Susanne, how would you read the Europeans able to overcome the 10 commandments that Vangelis has just advanced to us?
Yeah, thanks for that easy question. No, but I think it really boils down to one answer. The answer is you need to prove that what you have really announced with this tool. And the problem here is that the EU has, or the Commission and others who want to sell this tool to the world, have announced different purposes of the tool. And I think the one single legitimate purpose that could meet with these 10 principles is to protect the climate. And that would mean a lot of things have to be thrown overboard. The threat or the incentive that others follow the EU example, or this putting pressure on industries outside the EU. If the EU is serious about this, it should allow preferential treatment even to products from countries that are more efficient than the EU. So it needs to be proven that this tool is fully in line with the environmental target. Still, it will be challenged. I'm pretty sure there's so many inroads to challenge this tool legally, so that in parallel, the EU really needs to work together with the US to stabilize the WTO process with a new director in place. I think there are big chances this year to get to terms. Still, there are so many countries that will try to challenge as a matter of principle. So being ready for that challenge is part of the program. And as Vitalis said, Vangelis said is you need a lot of diplomacy to put this thing in place and keep it really focused and tailored to what the purpose is. So this is my brief answer to a very complex question.
Can I make a follow-up question, Susanne, to this? Because the Commission is going to come with a proposal. Now, the question is, how is that proposal going to be presented? Is it going to be presented as a document for consultation, or is it going to be presented as almost the law that needs to be hammered through Council and Parliament? Do you have any insights on that, how that could be packaged? Because that will, for the consultation that Vangelis has been underlining, will make quite an important difference.
Yes, I think it needs to be a document that is subject to. It's a first suggestion how to design this, a very first one, and then you need to buy a lot of time, and this needs to be. It needs to take into account that all the member states need to get their head around this proposal first, that there will be legal consultations on what is in this proposal. Also the poll is very interesting because I think it's really ambitious to start it in 2023. There is pressure to start it because of the revenue thing, and this needs to be put aside for time being, because this is the highest risk I see. How will you sell something that fills the pockets of the EU and then pretend it's purely environmental? Don't do that. I mean, that's really risky. So to answer your question, yes, I think it needs to be a first proposal, not a nearly finished legal text. And I think that's going to happen. I mean, that's speculative, but I expect this.
Thank you, Susanne. Now, Billy, a number of questions, where we had the preceding session on the triangle between the US, the EU, China. Lots of consultations necessary. would the United States play a leading role in this exchange of views? I mean, you outlined, everybody understands the argument, when the high carbon prices in Europe are really hitting, our CO2 intensive activities. Any view on that, Billy?
Well, I mean, I think as everybody has been saying, I think, too much focus on the the CBAMs for short, I think could be disruptive. I think there's a lot of other areas of alignment. And certainly the US wants to be ambitious in this space, so in the broader space of climate action. So I think is opportunity for collaboration with China and the EU on this. I also think the idea that Europe is talking about a CBAM, even if it's moving more slowly and not doing it immediately, could be the right balance. Because I do recall that when the US was talking about this idea, it did get people thinking they wanted to be on the right side of that. But I think actually going through with it, was what we were really trying to avoid, and kind of making it conditional on something that would be subject to a review, and it wasn't automatic. That sort of approach that put it on the table, but didn't really push it too quickly. I think, that could be useful for getting, some of the more recalcitrant people to think about it. But being aggressive, I think, is probably going to create more divisions.
Okay, that's a very important statement. I think that Europeans, as they are going to have a proposal on the table, could dress up that proposal as a document for negotiation and consultation. But then begs the question, where does that consultation take place? Some would say it should be in the context of the COP that is coming, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, for trade issues, it would be normal that it would take place in the WTO. So, Vangelis, question to you. How is your reading of the situation in the WTO? Would people be eager to take that question on the table and work on that? And you mentioned the APEC, which is a very important context. And one of the questions coming through is your big neighbor, Australia, is for sure also part of that APEC discussion. We are still eager to see a quite proactive attitude when it comes to climate issues from the side of Australia. So, WTO, okay, is it possible? Because if the WTO would not seize the occasion, I think the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change may start mingling into trade issues. Your reading?
So, on the WTO, I think that would be very challenging indeed. It has been extremely difficult to do something as modest as agree a list of environmental goods, for example, in the WTO space. So something as modest as agreeing, that a solar panel is a good thing and we should eliminate the tariff on that to reduce the price. We couldn't agree that in the Geneva context. In fact, we couldn't even agree it amongst a group of relatively like-minded economies in the environmental goods agreement negotiations. So and a border carbon tax, the CBAM, is a very challenging thing to bring to Geneva at a time when many developing countries will be suspicious that this is another protectionist measure that we still have not concluded, addressing agricultural subsidies, for example, which of course have a really significant effect on the opportunities for developing countries. So I think the Geneva piece is a very, very challenging one. There's no question, though, that if there was a wish to advance the CBAM, and as I say, intellectually, as an economist, I can understand this, but in a trade sphere, there are a lot of hoops that still need to be go through, and this is going to be a very skeptical audience. At the same time, it is clear, I think, to many of us in Geneva, and there are a number of groups of WTO members that are trying to work on this, that in terms of relevance, the WTO does need to have a response to and enable solutions on climate change. And look, I'm really sorry, I do come back to some of the lower hanging fruit here. Let's deal with some of the big things that we can do quickly. So some easy wins. It's 2009 when G20 economies said they wanted to reform fossil fuel subsidies. They've done precisely nothing. So it is time to deal with that. That is something that people could, there's $400 billion, more than $400 billion that people could save. And you would make a meaningful contribution very quickly to climate change in terms of mitigation. And then I think we need to start thinking about some of the other areas where, trade could enable environmental goods and so on. We should deal with some of the easy things while we continue to work, alongside those 10 principles I outlined to find solutions on the CBAM.
Okay, well, thank you, Vangelis. And I think you're coming close to many of us, who have been following the climate debate about saying coal is really the problem. And when we talk about coal, we know that China has signaled it is not making a drastic change in its coal mix. Would the fossil fuel subsidies debate, would that be having China as an addressee? Are they subsidizing coal? I mean, it's a very state-planned economy. So where is the line about the subsidy or free market, if I would say it bluntly from a European perspective?
Yeah, let's be blunt with each other. Yes, China is a subsidizer of fossil fuels, but so is the EU. So a number of EU member economies who have not been willing, to engage, for example, in peer reviews in the G20 process, are also major subsidizers, including of coal. So I think, yes, everyone needs to make this reform. I think that's really important. I do believe China has a responsibility. I do believe the United States does. I certainly believe the EU member states do too as well. This is an urgent challenge. And I do believe that the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainable Development, this initiative I've been talking about, is a practical way to swiftly deal with what is a pressing challenge.
Okay, well, thanks, Vangelis. And the clock is ticking brutally and very fast forward. But I think what I would take forward from the debate we were having, I think that we all agree, all four of us, that this is not going to be a walk in the park. And the EU and the polls demonstrate that people in Europe are expecting it's going forward. But at the same time, as Susanne was underlining, it's good to take a bit of time, a stepwise approach based on the proposal that the Commission may be making. That would be my first important conclusion. Leading to the second one, consultation. Not go too quickly, but consultation where? I took note of what Vangelis was saying. It's going to be challenging in the WTO to go fast. So that is looking at the United States in particular, who has been saying recently, which is very welcome, that the WTO needs reform and that the key nominations must be made soon. So that I think is a very important element that is also coming out of our debate. The third element is, and I saw nodding by all of us, it's coal, fossil fuels in general, and coal in particular, and coal subsidies. And I think Vangelis is right to point also the finger at Europe. We still have, policies protecting coal mining unduly. We know there are regional importances, around, and I think that may be also the question in the United States. Billy, would that be an issue that coal could be debatable? A very quick reply from your end.
I would just say I totally agree with Vangelis that I think working on fossil fuel subsidies could be quite productive. It's a priority of the administration, and I think it's something that needs to move ahead. Okay, well, it seems we have an additional dimension to work on, because we are not particularly in Europe importing a lot of coal. We are rather exporting CO2 intensive products. So that will require a little bit of debate and explanation as well. But coal and even the new facilities that are being planned in coal-fired power generation are really worrying. We have the old ones, which are very unproductive, where we are still building new ones, including in Europe, I have to admit. And I think that, I take that as a very welcome argument, Vangelis, that we have to do our homework, Susanne, in Europe, when the fossil fuel subsidies and context comes on the table, it's not going as fast as we would like. Now, I'm afraid we have used up our time.
But I think we had a very fruitful debate. Let's not go too fast. Let's take time for consultation, and let's think, you know, from all sides of the world about fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies. And I think that is a major, you know, takeaway that I take from this debate. And I would like to thank you all for your very constructive and sharp and focused intervention. Thank you.